just as a reminder why we're here and what the self-build hour was started for. It was really started as a way for us to bring self-build and self-build expertise to you in the comfort of your own living room or office or wherever you might be right now. These recordings are these programs are recorded, so you will have access to watch it on demand at your convenience, or go back and re-watch it if there was information you wanted to refresh on. But as always, the real benefit of being here live today is that you can ask questions of our invited expert. So we ask that you do that using the Q&A function. There are those of you who may not have that function, so that's not a problem at all. Just use the chat function. And we do welcome questions. Just type them in as they pop into your head during the presentation. So as I said, this will be recorded today. And I'm Jenny Chandela, as always, your host of the Self-Build Hour. I'm joining you from Allen Corfield Architects, and today we are really delighted to be joined by Mark Doodes of Mark Doodes Planning. He is a chartered town planner. He specializes really in UK residential development as well as self-build projects. So his previous experience within the private sector really has given him a lot of insights. So he's able to use that experience and also use the experience, working with his private clients to help those clients navigate planning constraints as well as potential appeals. So I hope you will please join me today in joining Mark as today's expert on the English planning system.
Hello, Jenny. Thanks for that handover. Can you hear and see me okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me along today. And I have got lots to say about planning. In fact, I run at the National Self-Build Centre a one-day training course, which is run, I think, twice a year. So for those of you who are interested in planning and want to learn a lot more in a lot more depth, certainly a lot more depth than you're going to see today, then I recommend visiting the National Self-Build Centre website and looking at their training courses, and you can join me in person for, I think it's about 5 or 6 hours, but there's a huge amount of content and you get to take away a lot of content with you as well. We go through case studies and pitfalls and such like that, so that's really good. Now I have got a presentation which I'm very happy to start, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
And let me share my screen.
Brilliant. I can see that.
Great. So let's just put that into. Yes, well, without further ado, I'll continue. So to clarify, because I know this could take 6 hours, Jenny, at the longest, I've got you'd like me to talk for around half an hour to 40 minutes, is that right?
Yes, that's perfect.
Yep. Okay, great. And if any of you do have any comments or questions rather, then please use the text chat box on your screen, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to cover those. So Jenny's right. Her and I work together on quite a few projects for mutual benefit. So we often use AC Architects for architectural design, and equally when Jenny needs some town planning input, often clients are referred across to us. So we are planning consultants. That's a photo of me sort of in lockdown, I think. And I have got a small team of 6 people, and we prepare planning applications day in, day out for our clients. We offer advice for self-builders generally. So the self-build market is one of our main markets, and we probably do over half of all of our work into the self-build market. So we're well versed in helping people through that those initial steps, certainly through to planning conditions being discharged. But my firm's been, I set up the firm about 13 years ago, having worked in local government for 10 years in the planning departments. And like I say, we have a small team of 6 people, another practitioner and administrators, and someone that does our basic CAD designs for things like outline permissions as well. I do think that a lot of people overlook town planners as being a source of information. A lot of people, there's a lot of misconception out there. A lot of people think town planners only work in the town hall for the council. And whilst that is true, there's I think 2/3 of all the professionals do work for town hall, but there's a group, certainly a pretty large cohort of a few thousand planning consultants who work throughout the country on the other side of the fence, if you like, preparing applications for public scrutiny. But I think planning consultants can add a lot of value to a site, particularly at the initial steps. We'll cover that in a moment. And you should definitely consider using a planning consultant if you are thinking about buying a site. So we'll cover that in a moment as well. We'll also cover some of the tips and pitfalls which we find happen with disappointing regularity or frustrating regularity sometimes. And I have already told you about that planning course. Now there is one, I don't have the date off the top of my head, but if you're interested, then go to the NSBRC website and you can find more information there. This is covered under a bit about us. So we offer we have 25 years experience. I think that planning consultants offer a lot of value pre-purchase. So if you are in a position, if anyone watching this is in a position where you are seriously thinking about buying a site, particularly at auction, then I do want to make sure that you do take proper advice beforehand. Before you do that, and I do think also that planning consultants had a lot of value when you are, say, inheriting land or dividing land. We're at the moment we're involved in a case where a couple are getting divorced and looking to split the assets between land and a farmhouse and a number of other buildings, and that's another example of when town planners can add value as well. But your planning consultant, like your architect, can also act as the central hub when to the project and appointing third parties, which are really important as well, because one of the jobs that the planning consultant will take on is vetting and proofing those third party reports to make sure that they are harmonious and all in agreement with one another. So your ecology report isn't concluding anything that contradicts your drainage report, or your highways report doesn't contradict your tree report, for example. And planning consultants also run appeals as well. But another key area where planning consultants add value is in planning strategy. Now, a lot of you might be looking at that slide or that part of the slide and think, well, I only want to build one house. How complicated can it be? I'm just going to make a full planning application for a single house or a conversion. And whilst that certainly is true for a minority, a significant minority, but a minority nonetheless of you, a planning strategy will add a lot of value in the sense that the process may not be as simple as you may presently think. So when you are looking at an application, one of the things that when you're looking at a site, one of the things that you are assuming is that the council know and understand what the present land use of that site is. A great example are barns. So barns can be erected for all sorts of reasons. A farmer could have erected a barn 50 years ago and then used it, I don't know, maybe for he didn't need it anymore, so let it out for a car garage. That car garage put an advert online or put a Google placement marker on, and then that garage could have folded 10 or 15 years ago, or never even set up in the first place properly. That's one example of where a barn the council may have ambiguity or question about what the lawful land use of that barn is. Another example might be where somebody has an equine barn. Someone might have kept a horse in a barn along with all the ancillary and peripheral paraphernalia, and so that barn there might be question marks about whether that barn is actually agricultural or equine, and that's relevant if you're looking to make a barn conversion under Class Q. But there are lots of scenarios when having clarity from the local authority, typically in the form of a certificate of lawfulness, might make a really good first step for you to do. And again, there are most areas of British sort of civil life, you always think I will go straight to the horse's mouth and I will approach, I don't know, the DVLA to ask a question about my driver's license, or I'll approach the passport authority to ask a question about my passport, or whatever it is, or the council tax department. In planning, you always have to be careful about approaching the council, because they may lead to a conclusion which actually may not be accurate or justified. I know an example where a farmer had been asked by a nearby equine business to store a horse walker in the barn, and of course that actually wasn't the farmer's horse walker, but of course it made it look like that was an equine barn. And so approaching a planning consultant can actually help you have an initial screening and an initial bit of advice. So yeah, that's planning strategy. Don't underestimate how many cases that do involve a 2 or possibly a 3 or 4 step process. So the British planning system, it's interesting because I was talking to a friend in Canada recently, and talking about how their planning system works. And there are many areas of British legislation which are emulated, particularly in the former colonies, the Commonwealth, where their regulatory systems actually emulate ours, and they've copied the legislation into their own statute books. But town planning isn't one of those areas. Town planning has some overlap in some countries, but most countries went a different route. But we have a spatial plan system, so that's works on the assumption that there's going to be a lot of mixed uses, land uses that are next to one another. And that's quite a sensible approach, because otherwise you can end up with, say, something like the American system, which is highly zonal based, where you can end up with most people being heavily reliant on the private motor car to drive around in between places, even within the day. So whereas in a British city, you might expect to walk or cycle or get a bus between your gym and your place of work, the train station, and friends' houses or whatever. But actually in America, where you have a zonal system and obviously a lot more land, you can end up with a system where you have a lot more dependency on travel through the private motor car. So that's one thing to defend the British system, but our system certainly is complex and hard to predict. And the reason why that is for lay people is because there are so many overlapping areas, and they have legislation. It's in the circle on your screen. You have legislation, regulations, so secondary legislation, national policy, which some of you hopefully have heard of, which is the NPPF. Then you have the local plan, which hopefully most of you have heard of, case law and appeals. I'm just going to talk a bit about each of those now, and why those change over time, but each of those has slight tensions with one another. So where you have a national policy about boosting the supply of housing, for example, that might have tension with a local plan, which might be, for argument's sake, out of date, or it might be planning for the wrong number of houses as per national quotas, which have recently been hugely increased under Labour government. And then what a lot of people may not be aware of under local plans is that actually over half, and I think the statistic is about 2/3 of local authorities simply do not have an up-to-date local plan. And some of those local plans, I can give a few examples, are 20 years out of date. And the preparation of those local plans obviously involves the allocation of land, and that is typically a highly contentious process locally, and ends up getting quite political with different political parties and different political members advocating for other parts of their district to be allocated for large housing growth. So that local plans can get very out of date, and also sometimes, and to be fair to local authorities, if you are fully aware that there's going to be a change in the national plan policy framework in 3 or 9 months' time, that's very much a disincentive to continue progress on your local plan. And for the record, the NPPF changed in December 24, and it's went out to consultation this year. The consultation finished last month, and we are at some point this year going to get a new NPPF, which of course means that all the work lots of local authorities have been doing on the old on their local plan in the context of the national NPPF from 2024 may now well be redundant. So the local plan is meant to be the go-to, the starting point for making applications, for considering applications. But there are lots of reasons why there would be deviations away from that position dictated in the local plan. So the next area is appeals. So I'm going to skip down one and go to appeals. With appeals, that's where typically a decision is refused. It goes to the Secretary of State at the Planning Inspectorate, and a decision is made. And appeals are an area where there can be, in quite a few circumstances, an appeal outcome in your site or site you're looking to buy or develop could easily be affected by an appeal outcome many, many miles away on the other side of the district. A great example of that is where 5-year land supply, the amount of housing in the pipeline, if you like, for local authorities over the next 5 years, where one of those decision made by the Secretary of State will determine whether or not the council actually has ample supply of housing coming through. And if it turns out that the inspector, when determining a relatively small case, it could just be 10 or 20 houses miles away, determines that the local authority don't have a land supply, then that appeal becomes highly relevant to your case, which might be just outside the village boundary, for example. And that's because paragraph 11D of the NPPF expects local authorities to attribute or ascribe diluted weight to policies in the context of a 5-year land supply shortfall. So that's why appeals can be relevant. You also may be aware that there's case law in planning as well. I mean, most weeks there's some form of a case which is handed down, certainly a few times a month, is handed down from the high courts or the planning courts about the particular wording of a particular passage in a local plan policy, or it could be a passage within an appeal or a passage of the NPPF. And then the greatest legal minds of the country would opine on what that meaning is, and some of those judgments that are handed down are actually quite interesting. Some of them, I have a great deal of respect for the judges who take a lot of time to explain the meanings of words, the origins of words, the provenance of the words, and what they mean. And it could even be, I remember there being one case, I think it was Higgins Holmes, in about 2016, there was an awful lot of discussion about the absence or presence of a comma in a particular passage of the NPPF. But yeah, that's case law. So, the thing that we really have noticed as consultants is that the case law and appeals, very often the planning officers aren't always aware of those having taken place. So it could be in another part of the country in a seemingly irrelevant matter, but actually those end up being germane to the district you're making an application in and your application. A great example would be in the Hibbett case in 2017, I think it was, about class Qs, and all of a sudden a new threshold was created where prior to 2017, class Q barn conversions could pretty much be any 4 sticks with a roof on top could be converted. But the judge said, in essence, that you can't convert air, so the building has to be enclosed and be capable of being converted within any reasonable ambit of that word. And of course that case some of you may be aware of, but that case ended up being used and is cited in nearly all class Q cases, certainly the ones that are refused, that we deal with, and whether that citation is accurate or the product of a misguided interpretation is often what we end up discussing at appeal. So you can see that one of the reasons there's not only 6 different areas to draw guidance from when making a judgment about whether an application or a site has prospects of being approved, but also one or more of those elements will change over time. And of course, that is an area whereas as people that aren't professionals would struggle to find out where to find case law, for example, or where to find track change versions of national policies or or even find the original legislation, because there's not just one Planning Act. Most people are probably aware of the 1990 Planning Act, but there's many others. You've got the 2004 Planning Compulsory Purchase Act. You've got 2016 Housing Act, which is or Housing and Self-Build Act, which has a lot of provisions in there. So you can see there's a lot of different separate primary pieces of legislation. But I will say, to advocate for my profession, whenever I fly over England, particularly into Gatwick, the flight path into Gatwick, it runs across the breadth of the country from the Bristol Channel down effectively above the M4 and then into Gatwick, and you realise actually how green our country is. And for all its flaws, at least one thing the planning system has done is left England largely green, and has provided a very to ensure that the release of greenfield land is under strict public scrutiny. Whether or not that scrutiny has swung too much in the opposite direction is probably a matter of a separate discussion. But you can see how other nations have used spatial systems. A great example is Belgium, that has a spatial system where you have far less thresholds around development, and so owning land, that's why Belgium is a good example of something that has very low density development, so sprawl development, whereas England has quite tightly and clear distinctions between rural and urban areas. So that's the planning system, which I know is meant to be the focus of this presentation, but I do have some other slides to talk as well, simply because it's too big a case, too bigger a subject to squeeze into half an hour or so. But when there's a good slide here on when to seek support from planning consultants. You don't actually have to use a planning consultant from the beginning of your project to the end. You can use them to produce specific pieces of work, notably a planning statement or a heritage statement. But also they are best deployed. So I've just noticed a typo actually in consultants up there. But they are best deployed as early as possible and best deployed to run the project. But of course, your budget may not stretch to that. But early on, so when selecting sites and shortlisting sites, and particularly at auctions, then planning consultants can be really useful. And we can think of lots of, in the practice, lots of pretty sad examples of where people have rushed in, bought a site. A great example is where someone's written, say, 500 letters over an 18-month period, trying desperately to find a plot of land. The first person that writes back to you, it's your human instinct to go and grab that and sign that site up as quickly as possible. But actually, even well done, you found a willing landowner, someone willing to sell or engage in the sale process. But don't conflate that with the site being acceptable in planning terms. So it's really important to take advice early on. And we offer, as a planning practice, we offer a site assessment process, which produces a report about 20 pages long. And that is £900 plus VAT, and that includes all the policy areas that you'll need. And it's kind of analysis heavy and constraints light is what I describe it as, because often we see other planning analyses that's very constraint focused. You know, the site is in a conservation area, the site is near a listed building, or the site has a TPO. Those are facts which are actually relatively easy to find for yourself. What you want to know when employing a professional is you want to know what are the ramifications of that, and would that result in something being tantamount to refusal or just being tantamount to folly to pursue. And so early on, the planning consultants can prepare applications, we can manage the whole process, we can do appeals as well. One stage that a lot of people do overlook is the optimization stage. So it's something that we always do cover. So once permission's been granted, planning is a slow process. So that process between us being engaged and permission being granted could sometimes, if something has to go to appeal, be 18 months. And in that time, your requirements could have changed. And so you could be looking at a bigger house, a smaller house, or what's most likely to happen, certainly since the Ukraine war, is that the price of erecting that structure has really gone through the roof. So it could have gone up 30%. And of course, if you had a finely balanced project with a fine budget, it all of a sudden could be the case that actually, well done, you've got planning permission, but you can't erect that dwelling anymore. And so the site optimization stage is a really worthwhile exercise. So that could be looking at whether, if, for example, you had a T-shaped building, whether you erect the main range of the building now and then come back and erect the last piece, or it could be that you don't build the garage, or it could be something more serious where actually you realise that you do need to raise more money full stop, and you want to look at subdividing that land to see if you can fit another house into it, then sell that plot to another self-builder and use that to build your house or top up the difference between your original budget and your new budget. And planning consultants obviously work with architects. I think we've covered that on the slides. I do want to talk a bit about what the key changes are in 2026. So the main one, these are not in any particular order, but the one I do really want to talk to you about is 5-year land supply. So we had a bit of an odd period in time where before the election, the then Conservative government reduced the targets imposed on councils in demonstrating land supply down from 5 years to 4 years, which is the first time that's ever been done. And it had exactly the resulting impact that the planning consultant industry warned government of, which would be to stymie the development of the delivery of housing, because councils didn't have to hit as high a target as previously. And the difference now is we do have 5-year land supply back on the table, and there's going to be increased emphasis on that, be it on councils meeting those targets as the 2026 moves on. And so we're seeing, certainly we've noticed a definite shift in the way decisions are made out of the planning inspectorate, with 5-year land supply being more and more important, and the ramifications of engaging paragraph 11D, which is the one relating to land supply in the framework, being taken more seriously by inspectors than perhaps previously. The second point about housing quotas. So one of the reasons why I think it's about 2/3 to 75% of the entire country no longer has a housing land supply target, no longer meets its housing land supply targets, and that's because the government have changed the target. So there is obviously a very, very close relationship between 5-year land supply and targets. Obviously, what you are planning for is 5 years of supply against a target. If you increase the target, your supply goes down, therefore, even though if you're building the same number of houses, the target number would actually go down. So the housing quotas have been increased in some instances, and I'm particularly thinking of the boroughs on the edge of London. So all of the ring of quite large boroughs, the likes of Havering and Bromley and Croydon, all of those boroughs which are on the outer ring of London. So you'll have Greenbelt on one side and inner London landlocked boroughs on the other. Those have seen their housing land supply increase enormously. I think Bromley have had their housing land targets increased. I think it's either 2 or 3-fold, and that's not unusual. Some authorities have had 50% increases. I think Wiltshire's had about 50% increase. Vale of White Horse has had an increase, I think about 25% or so. But those increases have really had a big ripple effect throughout. They've stimulated more planning applications, speculative applications, because your probability of success has increased. So housing quotas are really important. Changes to the NPPF. So this is a draft NPPF, which the consultation ended last month. We're expecting the new NPPF out later on in the year. There's much more focus on growth. You've got clarification on a few points in there as well. I don't want to talk too much about changes to the NPPF, simply because A, we don't know if they are actually going to make their way into the final version, the print version, and B, that I could simply spend at least another hour talking about those changes. But nonetheless, there are changes to the NPPF, and for developers and self-builders, those changes are almost all universally positive. One other point to mention is about the 4-year rule. As many of you have heard about the 4-year rule, so this is the one where you can retrospectively apply for planning permission in the absence of you achieving it in the first place. You used to be able to apply after just 4 years, but the rules changed last year. I think it was actually 2024, summer 24, where it's now 10 years in most instances. And that is important because 4 years, particularly with a huge global lockdown in the middle, was actually relatively easy to achieve. But government saw that as being too short a period of time to go undetected by planning enforcement. So it's now 10 years. That is important, particularly when we were talking earlier about remember that garage I talked about, the car garage that might have traded for a number of years. If that has that period of time would have to be 10 years before that land use has lapsed. And I suppose point number 5 is something that's actually pretty surprising, is that now in the new NPPF, the planning members, i.e. members making decisions on planning applications of planning committee, must now be trained, which I think a lot of people would probably look at that and think, I can't believe it's 2026 and that is the first time that has been actually discussed. And there have been some examples which have gone certainly viral within the planning consultant community. I don't think they've hit anything like you're not going to see a 6-7 trend in that instance, but a lot of videos I've seen circulated where planning committee members have simply tried to invent policy on the camera, on a recorded camera stream, to suit their own underlying preference that the application be refused. So that's good to see. That's a positive change. The other change to really discuss is a change that only took place a few days ago, 8 days ago, in fact. Planning appeal changes. The planning inspectorate have been criticised, and rightly so, for being quite tardy in making decisions. I think our record was 2.5 years for a certificate of lawfulness application to be determined. But most appeals, to be fair, take around 9 to 12 months, but that's still a relatively long period of time, particularly if somebody has an option agreement that might be sunsetting soon. So one of the things that the government have changed is about appeals, looking to streamline it. And this is an area where I don't agree. I don't believe this is the right thing to do, that you can no longer, as of now, submit additional reports with your appeal. And this is a problem because imagine if you had a planning application with a highways report, a highways issue that only came to light halfway through the application cycle. It had a highways objection. You could have an egregious planning officer who is absolutely adamant that they are not going to entertain additional documents or revised documents. It used to be the case that we could have the highways consultants prepare a report and submit that with the appeal. That is now no longer the case, and you're meant to go back into the local authority, apply again, with the document added in, and then possibly get approved, but quite possibly end up being refused months later. So it's something that I don't agree with personally, and I think that the planning consultant community are in the midst of writing a letter, effectively sort of a collective complaint to the planning inspectors about that policy. So I do hope that gets reversed. Ecology changes. So we may have heard in the news certainly about all those dastardly developers looking to get out of their 10% BNG biodiversity net gain requirements. But actually the reality is that those same rules that apply to Barratt Homes also apply to most surprising number of other planning applications, which are pretty irrelevant. It would include, we dealt with recently a farmer wanted a new access. This was in Berkshire. Farmer wanted a new access. The access was onto a classified road, so therefore required planning permission. Relatively simple application, you're all thinking. But so we made the application. We did warn the client that the following could happen, but we made the application. It was deemed invalid because the LPA wanted to include the red line area, the red line visibility, the visibility space within the red line, which would obviously include a very large polygon of land going in either direction to incorporate displays, which on a 60-mile-an-hour road could be, I think, around 125 meters in either direction. Either way, that resulted in the Red Line tripping over the de minimis exemption of 25 square meters in the BNG regulations, and therefore they needed a BNG statement. We can't do a BNG statement without an ecology survey, and the ecology survey noted that there are a few trees within the nearby hedgerow, which was in the visibility display, so we had to have a number of other surveys done for that. The visibility displays themselves required a topographical survey and a highways consultant input because some of the cambers were adverse. And so you can quickly see how a relatively well-intended piece of legislation aimed at larger schemes ends up affecting farming clients and small clients all over the country. And it looks like those regulations are going to be changed quite soon to lift the requirement from not just making self-builders exempt, but also anything under, I think, 10 houses or even 50 houses could be the right way. And that is something I do feel is absolutely the right thing to do, because the burden of the creep of the regulatory regime onto small schemes has just been inexorable over the last few years. But yeah, those are the key changes in there. And of course, there could be more coming out now. There's an awful lot changing the government. The Labour government, to be fair to them, have really seen the planning system as being a good way to stimulate growth and bring jobs and generate prosperity and hopefully alleviate the symptoms of our housing crisis, which has been around for at least 20 years and but is now getting a lot more coverage and recognition, which is really good to see. I'm going to, so with experience judgment, I think my point on this slide, and there's obviously only 2 words on there. My point on this slide is that most sites have issues. Most sites have something that's subprime about them, something that could be a problem, could be a neighbour's tree, a third-party tree, which root protection zone could creep into your site. It could be problems with the junction geometry for your access. It could be all sorts of things. And so, but the planning system only produces zeros and ones. It only produces a refuse or a pass, refuse or approve. And so what you need, what you actually, when most people look at sites, and rightly so, is that they look at an amber light on a traffic light. And a planning consultant with a decent amount of experience, but notably in the public sector, where you've seen all sorts of permutations of mistakes that people have made from the other side of the fence. What you want in your planning consultant is to advise you whether that problem could be overcome through design or argument or reports and become a green light, or whether that problem would end up snowballing into something which actually is fatal to the application. And so obviously, we're not, planning consultants are not magicians. We can't make unacceptable sites acceptable, wholly unacceptable sites acceptable. But equally, we can use our judgment to predict what we think is the likely outcome. I've got a bit more about why using planning consultant, but actually, I think all of these points, noting the time, I think all of these points I've covered in other slides. The only point I did want to talk a little bit about was that planning consultants do have no vested interest in one outcome or the other and have your interests at heart. And the final point there about having a low profile is a frustration of mine, that often you find solicitors or surveyors or estate agents even talking about town planning changes whenever you see them talking on the radio or on the news. And obviously, when talking about the housing crisis, you would have thought that a town planner would be the obvious choice to engage in that debate. So if anyone from the BBC is listening, you should drop me a line. So preparing an application, I think we can talk a bit about this. I'm just going to ask Jenny, so we're 40 minutes-ish in. I've got 5 more minutes, okay? I'm hoping it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. The key steps really, I think, often securing the site, that might sound really obvious, but you would be legitimately surprised how many people you see who have chosen their heat pump system or their building system, whether it's a concrete system or a wooden frame or whatever it is. They've chosen all of those bits and don't have a site. Obviously, without the site, which is actually the raw ingredient for your project, you are going to struggle. So securing the site is really important. And in general, if you don't own the land and it's not at auction, I do really like option agreements. So if you haven't heard of an option agreement, it's where you would approach the landowner, you have a legally binding contract, which the landowner has to sell the site to you at a fixed price or a percentage of its open market value once the permission is granted. And that would usually have a time period. It could be 2 years or 4 years or a little longer. And then that is a great way of securing a site. And the reason why is that you won't pique the interest of the landowner by offering him agricultural rates for the land. He could sell that to any other farmer for those rates. So you would inevitably end up offering them more than the site is worth at its present land use value. And then you could spend £20,000-30,000 on planning, or even a lot more, fail, which is of course possible, and then you're left with a piece of England which is only really good for farming. And you might have problems with budgets, you might have to repay debts or whatever on the land that you've accrued, you might have to sell the land, and unfortunately that farmer would be in an excellent position to buy the land, but he's not going to buy it off you at what you paid, he's going to pay agricultural value for it. So just be careful when acquiring sites. Assess the constraints. There are lots of great online resources for assessing the basic constraints, the man-made constraints, things like green belt, things like conservation areas. Just make sure you're using the most up-to-date set of resource repository. And then the second area are man-made, natural constraints, things like flood zones, there's a really good map online. Always check things like surface water mapping as well. There's lots of other areas that you can check yourself to at least filter off wholly unacceptable sites. So sites, anything in flood zone 3, for example, or flood zone 2, those are unlikely to get planning permission, or there are examples of when they would get permission, but I don't have time to go into those. But equally, when looking at the green belt, a greenfield site in the greenbelt has, statistically speaking, the lowest probability of success. If you're looking at brownfield sites in the greenbelt, which are called grey belt now, those have to meet certain criteria, but statistically speaking, 80% of grey belt applications actually get approved at appeal, which is a pretty remarkable statistic. So that government policy of wanting to develop the non-beautiful, non-contributing parts of the green belt, of which there are a lot, has actually been immensely successful. So I took a lot of comfort from reading that statistic. And to be clear, grey belt has to be green belt. You can't just land outside the grey belt cannot be green belt. So it has to be green belt first and then become grey. But yeah, there's more information you can find online at that about the size of the site, etc. Budgeting for the worst case scenario. So don't think when you have a budget at the beginning and planning is expensive. Planning is expensive. It's often aggravated up by third-party reports. So that could be ecology, if you have an ecology report done, which will probably cost you about £2,500. Have an ecology report done. That, of course, could highlight that there are other issues. It could be bats or newts, dormice, etc. on the site, which actually then mean more expenditure. So and the same with drainage. If you think there's a drainage problem or you've got clay soil in the area, any of those issues, you are going to need to do things like percolation testing, surface water drainage reports. Those are all quite costly reports. So budgeting for the worst case scenario is really important, because a lot of people might spend a lot of money, say on an architect, for example, or it could on planning consultancy, but not allow or be ill-advised to include as many of those other things as possible within your budget envelope. Obviously, if you don't spend it, great. But what you don't want to be in is a position where you've committed all your funds on day one of the planning application going in, and it turns out actually you do need an archaeology report or whatever it is. So budgeting for the worst case scenario is really important. Assembling and listening to the team is very important as well. So do that at the very outset. If you think you've got problems with access or trees or whatever it is, for goodness sake, get an expert out on the site and actually listen to what they're saying. Simply having a report isn't good enough. The report, you actually have to take the actions out of the report as well. Selecting the best strategy, this can lead to an awful lot of wasted time by having the wrong strategy to start out with. And a planning consultant should advise on that, and submitting the most robust scheme. So taking advice, including all the reports you think will be necessary, noting in particular the point that I said earlier about the change to the appeal system. You can't rely on the appeal system to submit those additional reports. You will need to put those either in at the beginning or have a positive-minded planning officer, which most are, to allow you to include those reports to address criticism from statutory consultees. So I think final slide, number one mistake that people make will be overpaying for land. So once you've overpaid for the land, there's lots of lots of people out there right now who have bought land they're on a tightly defined budget in 2021, say, which meant that they could afford, £200,000, let's say, for the land. They've paid £200,000 for the land, but then, of course, the Ukraine war struck, and all the costs of materials skyrocketed, and they generally speaking haven't come down. And it may be the case that you simply can no longer erect the dwelling, even if you got permission. So overpaying for land often leads to problems in planning, because even though commercial matters aren't a planning consideration, they certainly would have a ramification on whether or not you're actually going to develop out and implement the permission. So overpaying for land. Number two, asking the right questions of the wrong people. So a lot of people, and this comes back to that point about profiling planning, a lot of people ask the right questions, but they might be asking them of an estate agent or a surveyor or a solicitor or even an architect about quite nuanced matters of town planning law or town planning policy. And whilst all of the professions I've said, possibly with the exception of estate agents, have a reasonable knowledge of town planning, there is a difference between a sort of day-to-day knowledge of what to do versus a very detailed assessment. And we can think of plenty of examples where they've been well-intended but not thorough advice given. I suppose a bit of a cheeky point here, thinking free advice is worth more than you pay for it. We do get approached, I would say, 4 to 5 times a week by people who want advice, know they need advice, but are simply not prepared to pay for it. The reason why you want to pay for your advice is that advice will be written, and it will actually mean something. It will be well researched and give you a really clear steer on what the issue is. And of course, all planning consultants have to carry insurance. We have £1 million PI insurance, which thankfully has never had to have a claim made on it, but the advice we've given has been good, or certainly as good as we could have reasonably foreseen. And then finally, so poor quality submission, not submitting everything, that things don't agree with one another, etc. Not being flexible. Planning will end up with compromise in something, and it is important that if you have some ideas in the back of your mind about where you could compromise, typically on size, but not always. On that, SIL forms. I am wrapping up, Jenny, I promise. SIL forms don't become a statistic. The SIL forms are very easy to make mistakes on. There are 4 steps. You have to fill out the correct form at the correct time and have that acknowledged by the council. I think it's 4 times. If you fall foul of those, the local authority will be perfectly within their legislative rights, or regulatory rights rather, to impose a fine and the full SIL charge. A great example, the most common one I think people have problems with, is starting the project, starting physically on site without informing the local authority in advance and having it acknowledged. But don't become a statistic. There are lots of case studies out there. Don't become a High Court case study. Focusing on price, not outcomes. So yeah, that's if that's I suppose is about price sensitivity. Making sure you've assembled the right team and they're of good quality. Number 8, don't assume town hall will hold your hand. Yes, you have paid a planning fee. Yes, you probably pay council tax every month, but that does not entitle you to have the unrestricted attention of your planning officer 6-7 hours a day for a couple of months. They are going to be working they're going to be working a simultaneous caseload of anything from 40 to 70 cases, which is a lot more than when I was in town hall. Don't expect the process to be quick and simple. I think if you all remember watching the Kevin MacLeod show, the grand designs, no one finishes the show as the credits roll saying, well, thank goodness that British planning system was predictable, consistent and inexpensive to interact with. You can get through, many people do get through quickly, but it does take time. Planning applications take time, so factor that into your application. So that, I think this one here we've talked about, so I'm not going to cover that. And that's the end of my presentation. I know I've probably overrun, Jenny, but I'm sorry about that.
No, that's no problem at all. I'm glad you brought up the NSBRC